The classic approach to the exposure for landscapes is to retain as much detail in both the sky and land as possible. Now we'll look at how filters can help you balance the exposure later on, but let's start with how you can use the histogram display and exposure compensation to get the best results without filters. In aperture priority mode, the camera will automatically set the exposure. But while this is often fine, it still can produce images which are too light or too dark depending on the conditions. The most common situation that you'll find in landscapes is if you include large areas of bright sky in your shot. The camera will then set the exposure for the sky, causing the land to become underexposed. In these conditions, the histogram will look something like this, with a large amount of the graph bunched to the left. To correct this, you need to set the exposure compensation to a plus value to increase the exposure. And then take another shot to check that the graph hasn't gone too far to the right, which will mean that you lose too much highlight detail. The opposite occurs if the scene is mostly dark, producing an overexposed shot with the histogram bunched to the right. This time you need to set the exposure compensation to a negative value to correct it. But you don't always need to keep all of the detail for dramatic images. A classic case is when shooting a strong graphic subject, especially if the light is behind it. In this case, you might get a more powerful image by underexposing, so the subject becomes a silhouette. An alternative approach to shooting into the light is to overexpose slightly to emphasise the brightness of the scene. This can be particularly good when branches and leaves obscure the brightest areas of the sky, rather than have large areas of sky without any detail. So, while you should normally try to use an exposure to get the maximum tonal range in your shots, don't feel that you always have to see detail in the darkest shadows and the brightest highlights.